in the right place. This is the workshop that's focused on cybersecurity on the internet. My name's Louise Bennett, and I'm chairing this panel. I'm going to do a few introductory remarks. Then Ian Brown will be speaking to us. He's from the Oxford Internet Institute over here. Then Christian, if he's sorted himself out, Christian Zarinaga, who is just coming round there. And finally, Andy Smith from BCS. Hidden by the pillar, for some of you, is David Williams from BCS, who's actually also in the way of the going to be taking notes. He's got a recorder to help him take notes of the discussion. Is everyone happy with that? Good. Thank you very much. Well, as I said, this workshop is focused on cybersecurity on the internet. I think I'm talking to the converted here. Transactional security is actually vital for internet commerce, and effective policing and protection of citizens' rights and identities is vital for citizens' trust in the internet. The UK has taken a leading role, as we heard earlier this morning, through the Internet Watch Foundation and the UNIGF in gaining international acceptance to the takedown of sites with child online exploitation and abuse. We'd like to see the UK leading this debate into new areas, and we're seeking the views of other delegates here today on practical outcomes that could be achieved given the very disparate worldviews of law enforcement and cybersecurity. When I was a director of security, we used to remind ourselves every day that security is a grudge purchase. And I think it's really important to remember that no one actually cares about information security. I say that slightly provocatively. It's a very dry, boring topic of geeks and nerds, like those of us sitting up here. What the public actually cares about are the consequences of insecurity online. And that means things like impersonation, fraud, theft, industrial espionage, sabotage, and predatory behavior. I'd like to start by outlining the type of cybersecurity governance activities the UK might want to press for before handing over to the panel. Governance of the internet has been dominated, as we also heard earlier today, since mid-2013 by the revelations of Edward Snowden about the extent of NSA surveillance. This controversy concerns vital elements of trust in the use of the internet. The erosion of trust in the UK government and companies is in danger of some people wanting the global commons to be turned into a gated commons. The BCS view is that balkanisation is in no one's interest and will certainly not assist global business growth. Indeed, the US Information Technology and Innovation Foundation has recently estimated that international distrust of activities of US intelligence agencies on the internet could cost US businesses between 22 and 35 billion pounds in the next 3 years. It's absolutely vital that we don't let reactions to surveillance by governments seeking to protect their citizens from dominating the debate on cybersecurity. So the key areas for consideration that we're wanting to explore, particularly in this panel, where improved international cooperation, if not outright declarations of agreement, could improve things, are the suppression of illegal content, enhanced ability to enforce legislation and pursue criminals, transnational contract liability models, real-time authority to trace transactions through different providers with reciprocal agreements, and the need to promote the basics of cybersecurity to all citizens and businesses. So I'll hand over first to Ian Brown to outline his thoughts on this. We're having a bit of trouble interacting with slides and remote participation.
I thought it would be helpful, given Louise's outline, to look at one area where actually there is already broad international agreement, but it's an area where there tends to be less discussion of how internet governance would fit into a very well-developed framework of international law. In particular, the next slide, please. It's hard to give a presentation without my slides, I'm afraid. Someone's trying to. Okay, success. Is the international human rights law framework. You hear a lot in the UK about the European Convention on Human Rights, and obviously that's important, and that has a big influence across the 47 member states of the Council of Europe, which is not just the EU. I'm sure you don't make that mistake, but the media very frequently does. It runs right all the way from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific coast, including Russia. But even more broadly than that, of course, one way to try to encourage broader consensus about how some of the issues that Louise mentioned might be addressed, whilst at the same time effectively protecting human rights and avoiding all of the Snowden-related issues that she mentioned is, and how many in the room have even heard of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights? I'm sure some of you will have, but it's not a broadly discussed legal instrument, but it's a UN treaty that was signed in 1966. It's the basis for the European Convention, and well, the two strongly influenced each other. The European Convention is actually older, but it was the groups of people involved were very similar, and they've strongly influenced each other, particularly their interpretation since the treaty was agreed in the late 60s. There's a UN Human Rights Committee, which states are elected to. The UK is on that committee. There is a UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. You may well have heard of Frank LaRue, who was, until just a few days ago, I think, the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Opinion and Expression, who has done a lot of work trying to develop this international law for the internet era. But there are other special rapporteurs also, particularly relevant on fundamental freedoms and protection of human rights while countering terrorism. That was Martin Shainin. Until recently is now a British lawyer, Ben Emerson. And I'm not going to spend any more time on the background, but the next slide, please. Here's the key reason that this is a very useful instrument in these discussions. It's signed by almost all countries in the world. You can see there's a glaring luminous green gap there. Actually, the pre-communist Chinese government did sign the convention, but then a revolution intervened, and the Communist Party has never ratified the convention. But apart from China, and also you can see Saudi Arabia is the other big gap, and Malaysia, almost every other country in the world has signed onto this instrument. Next slide, please. A reason I think it's very useful to talk about the ICCPR is that actually the UN has done a lot of work over the years developing the framework in light of the significant challenges to human rights and the rule of law by terrorism and by counterterrorism operations. And I'm not going to read through the quotes here, but this is from the UN's High Commissioner on Human Rights fact sheet on counterterrorism. And as you can see, sometimes human rights debates slightly descend into a sort of human rights versus counterterrorism or versus law enforcement and security. That's not at all how this convention has been interpreted over the years. The UN and the special rapporteurs and others have gone to a lot of effort to look at the clearly very significant challenges that terrorism poses for states under the rule of law. Clearly, the right, as Tony Blair used to love to say, the right not to be blown up is a pretty fundamental right, and it's something, the right to life is absolutely part of this human rights framework. You can see in the second quote there, security of the individual is a basic human right. And so I think this is another useful part of this international law framework. It really addresses very directly the the very important duty that states have to protect their citizens against terrorism and other serious unorganized crime. Next slide, please. Having said that, one of the ways that the framework addresses the interaction between human rights and counterterrorism and fighting serious crime is that, and again, I won't go through them and you can't quite see them on this screen, but over the years, those bodies that I mentioned have developed a set of rules that say where states are going to restrict human rights like privacy or freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of assembly, and so on, they have to do it on the basis of, first of all, of law. So they have to set out in their legal framework under which circumstances, which justifications, how far intrusions on those rights can go. It has to serve a legitimate interest in a democratic society, which of course includes law enforcement and protection of national security, should not be abused to protect governments from embarrassment or from exposure of wrongdoing. Intrusions have to be necessary and proportionate to the aims. They should not involve discrimination based on race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin. So a long list there you can see of anti-discrimination protections. They shouldn't confer excessive discretion on relevant authorities. That links back to the law point that being based on law doesn't just mean passing a one-section act of Parliament or Congress that says, for the purposes of counter-terrorism, the following state agencies may intrude on privacy. It has to set out in detail the circumstances under which that's allowed and prevent arbitrary exercise of that power. And actually, that is, in one way, the biggest problem with the UK legal framework when it comes to GCHQ and others, which is being challenged at the European Court of Human Rights by Big Brother Watch and others, that the safeguards, I don't doubt that there are very strong and detailed safeguards in place constraining how GCHQ uses these mass surveillance capabilities they have. The problem from the international law perspective is that they're not that the core of them, if you like, is not fully set out in statute. So a British citizen or anyone else using the internet that's affected by that intrusion can't fully understand what the safeguards are. Next point, please. Next slide. Having said that, I think you've gone forward too. Could you go back one? Oh, there's one missing from this deck. Okay, well, let me just very briefly say, I've got the full version on my iPhone. Having said all of that, clearly there are special circumstances under which states might have to go further, and public emergencies or times of war, as the Covenant and other international human rights law instruments say. That said, the war on terrorism, in quote, is not war in that sense. It's rhetoric. A war has not been declared. We can discuss that if you like, but the important point is, again, it's just not good enough for the Western democracies to say we are at war against terrorism, therefore these rules don't apply. That's not the sense in which war is meant. Next slide, please. And then lastly, and I think this will be particularly relevant to those of you in industry, I think a really interesting development in the last few years, the Covenant and international human rights law applies to states, doesn't apply directly to industry, to other non-governmental organizations, although states have to pass laws implementing the Covenant, which of course can apply to industry. But one thing the UN has developed are their guiding principles on business and human rights. You might have heard of the Ruggie principles. That's what these are. And those try to help responsible businesses to develop codes of conduct and to make sure that they are protecting their customers' human rights. And I think they set out a really interesting process and a useful and I hope helpful process for businesses to work through when they're trying to look at ways in which within their corporate social responsibility framework, they can protect their customers, whilst, of course, at the same time helping intelligence and law enforcement agencies prevent serious crime and serious harm against their customers and others. Next slide, please. So what Dawa Korf and I set out in the report for the Global Network Initiative, which looked at this issue, which you can find online if you're interested in getting more detail, were a set of recommendations particularly to states and industry in thinking about protecting human rights. And these then link up very strongly to some of the suggestions that Louise was talking about in terms of what industry might do to facilitate law enforcement online. So first of all, we suggested that that ISPs and other internet companies, when they're thinking of entering a new market, so this is particularly when those businesses are thinking of entering a country that does not have such well-established rule of law and human rights protection as the democracies, as the EU member states, as Northern America, much of Southern America. To give an example that was very much in the news a couple of years back and is again sadly in the news of Egypt, and what companies that are on the one hand trying to live up to their human rights obligations, but on the other hand are getting, for example, as telecoms, including Western telecoms companies, got from the Egyptian government whilst the revolution was ongoing there, demands that they send out SMSs to all their customers, putting one side of the argument's points, or cutting internet connection off for several days at key points. We said industry responsible companies should be very sure about what the legal framework actually is before they enter a market, and whether they are likely to be subject to those kind of demands in states that don't have full implementation of the international covenant. And that's not to say there are no circumstances under which those companies might decide that they don't want to go into those markets, but there are things that they can do in making that decision and in how they design the services in the market, which I'll mention in a moment, that might be relevant. Secondly, if I can see it on my phone here. No, that's not working. Thanks. Particularly when companies are going into those markets, but not only those markets, more broadly, they can think about mechanisms they can put in place to make sure that their products and services aren't used for serious human rights violations. There's a whole range of those, some of them entirely focused on the company, some of them working with states to try to protect them in doing this, so they could think about what the contractual provisions say with their customers. So for example, how broadly are contractual provisions that allow content to be taken down by the internet company phrased? If they are phrased very broadly, if they give great discretion to the company to take down specific user content, well then, if a government comes along and puts pressure on the company to do that, that's one less safeguard that's in place for that to happen. To think, hopefully before the government turns up banging on the door, threatening to arrest your staff and seize your assets, what kind of dispute resolution procedures and processes that you might put in place to try to avoid getting to that stage, making sure industry has clear channels back to their home government, in particular, if they need to get diplomatic support on these issues. Certainly that's something that the US and the UK and other European governments, I think, would be happy to have those discussions and to provide some of that support. We've already seen it with some of the giant internet companies, for example, the US government providing diplomatic support to companies like Google when they were under pressure from certain governments, but also technical measures that industry can put in place. That might be very straightforward, and it links to the regionalization point to some extent, as Google did with China. Are you offering some kinds of services but not others? So perhaps allow search but don't offer Gmail in certain markets where if you don't think you can protect the privacy of your users in that market. Think about where you hold the data. You probably don't want to put data centers. I know this is obvious, but you don't want to put data centers in repressive states where the police or the army might bang on the door and seize all of your customer data. You might look at using encryption by default on all of your connections to your customers, and certainly, Google and Yahoo and Microsoft have learned this one post-Snowden, certainly in high capacity links between your data centers where all of your customer data is flowing backwards and forwards over the internet. You probably want to encrypt those with with standards that aren't compromised by the US government. You could say that before you as a company are willing to take down content or to hand over user data, you require a legally binding request from a government to do that, but you won't just do it on a voluntary basis. That will protect you and your customers, and it links back to the human rights law perspective that where intrusions are going to happen, they should be set out in law so that there's due process protection, so that your customers know when content might be taken down, user data be accessed for which reasons, and they might give them a chance to contest it in court in terms of protecting their interests. We strongly recommended that rather than governments looking to make it much easier for user data to flow between jurisdictions directly in law enforcement investigations, that instead governments streamline but make use of the existing international procedures that there are to support that kind of cross-jurisdictional evidence gathering, these MLATs, mutual legal assistance treaties, that they are far too slow today for that to be effective. It can take 18 months sometimes for requests to be answered. Clearly, that really is no use at all in law enforcement investigations. But I think there are ways, particularly working through, for example, the 24/7 network, contact point networks set up under the Cybercrime Convention, that could be made to work much better. And then lastly, the again, obvious, but I think worth reiterating, much more transparency about what's happening, both by states themselves and by internet companies. And we've seen just in the last month, Vodafone's very detailed transparency report, which I think was a very positive step forward. The big internet companies like Google and Microsoft, of course, have been publishing those transparency reports for a number of years. So that's very helpful to have hard data on the scale of what's happening in terms of law enforcement and intelligence access to user data. I'll stop there. I've got a couple more slides if anyone later wants to talk about specifics on the Cybercrime Convention, but I think we all want this to be as interactive as possible. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Ian. We wanted to have an overview to start with of those means that already exist, if we use them more, to enable global cybercrime. I think Ian touched on one of the really hard points, which is the time it takes from asking a question to getting an answer. And we know that criminal sites pop up and pop down in minutes, not months. In order to be interactive, keen, if you've got specific questions you want to ask Ian about his presentation, to ask them now. Then we'll go through the other panel members' ideas and thoughts, and then have a more general discussion. So are there specific questions from the audience for Ian on his presentation? Oh, the man in green again. We all need to use microphones, because otherwise the remote participants can't hear what we're saying.
And you've picked up on probably one of the most significant problems we face today, namely the complete failure of the MLAT system. 18 months, yes, I've seen it happen, and I know why it's a problem. And yet the officers are perfectly able to cooperate with each other and exchange intelligence in as many minutes. So it's the process that's wrong. We understand that. The key question is, considering how much the governments say they are trying to do to help fight cybercrime, why is it still wrong? What are the drivers that are making the governments keep it as it is? And I don't really think manana cuts on this one.
It can sometimes be depressing to discuss those reasons, because you think, can we get around them? I will try to be optimistic. I think one optimistic thing that's happened on this is actually the Obama administration's request to Congress for a very significantly higher level of funding for the US Department of Justice, specifically to process mutual legal assistance treaty requests. Obviously, the US is incredibly significant in this debate, because that's where so much data is held, so much user data is held. So I'm hoping that will start to make a difference. I think it can. I think there are some issues that make it not completely trivial and automatable. in answering MLAT requests. I mean, actually, because one of the important functions of the MLAT system is to make sure that states can protect important public policy interests. So, for example, in looking at requests from a country that was not a democracy for evidence on one of their citizens doing something that would be completely legal in the US or in Europe, perhaps someone exercising their freedom of speech to criticize a repressive government. Quite rightly, the US government and European governments would not pass on those MLAT requests. I think actually, though, that is another reason why this international human rights law framework is really worth working within, because one thing it lets you do is say, where states reach the standards of international human rights law, then that's one potential blockage that is much less significant. And you might be able to, at least between a smaller number of states, have much more streamlined processes for transferring the evidence.
Philip?
At no point did you refer to OECD or UNCITRAL, and when it comes to the, let's say, expediting MLAT, the role of global intermediaries who have relations with local law enforcement in virtually the entirety of the world, some of them, and can expedite things without using any of the MLAT procedures, but doing it legally, because what they are doing is legal within the individual jurisdictions.
Indeed, and that is a helpful practical approach, Philip. At the same time, I think very important for those companies to have a very good process in place to decide under which circumstances they will allow that per jurisdiction, what processes they might put in place to make sure that they are not going to wake up the next morning to a gigantic media catastrophe if they've handed over data under a circumstance that then is not so well supported. So to give you an example, I know you're aware of this, Philip, but other people might not be, that some of the big US internet companies, social media companies, although in their perspective they're not bound by the UK Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act and its provisions to hand over communications data, some of them voluntarily actually, so long as the UK authorities go through the RIPA procedures to authorize access to communications data, not to content, then they will supply that data. So I think that's a good example where American corporations, with obviously in the UK, big subsidiaries here, have looked very carefully at the local legal framework. They've said, we think it generally speaking protects human rights. Here are some specific safeguards. If those safeguards are followed, then we're willing to cooperate on that basis.
Thanks very much. If there are no immediate questions for Ian, I'd like to hand over to Christian now.
Okay. Testing. Am I okay here, or? There's a slide here, yeah. Okay. Well, we'll wait for the remote users. Is that the... Shall we do a dance? Okay. All right. That's fine. I will. So I'm Christian Laranaga. My interest in this area has normally been actually fairly operational. In the sort of CEO and a developer of networks and application services. So I've not really got myself involved in over the years in sort of deep policy issues around surveillance or pervasive monitoring, also called, except in the sort of the guise of where it interferes with daily life to some extent, or in any strategic planning of a new operation. The situation changed slightly in 2012 because what was suspected became overt, and what became overt as to what was going on sort of escalated and escalated as a small number of revelations as to what people were doing emerged. And normally speaking, that probably wouldn't have mattered too much, but the reactions have been quite interesting. And I don't think we can beat about the bush. Security is as much about reputation management as it is actually about a policy of having pieces of paper saying you'll do X and you'll do Y in certain circumstances, which is almost always what security actually comes down to when you look at company security. So saying the UK internet is toxic, as Edward Snowden has done, is a pretty interesting comment to make. I mean, what does he mean by that? Is it true? And it's had a big effect. And when people in the UK go to international meetings, one of the things we find is that people are saying, well, what's going on? What is the UK debate on this? Is there an issue here? Should we be pulling our data out of the UK? Are we getting put more orders into the UK market? Should we be doing data servers in the UK? So these are all important issues. And these issues have not really, I feel, been addressed in the security debate, in the big S security debate. Largely, I feel that it's being taken as sort of read. You bung a few million to BT or Verizon, whoever, and they will put a nice little signaling to connect in, take some data, and nobody will notice. There's no cost anywhere else. Well, that cost now is escalated. So what do we do about this, and how do we respond? That on its own would have been probably where I've taken it, except for one fact. If you want to just move some slides forward. Was some comments from people that I've noticed who are very influential and very important parts of our community. So British Ross Anderson, for instance, is very well known by some people in the security world. He's advised, very important organizations, British Medical Association, Law Society, Bar Council, and others, to think about this very deeply. Should they be ethically using cloud services for client confidential information? Next slide. Bar Council says we've had a long concern that the existing legislation fails to respect the right of individuals to consult privately with a lawyer. That's almost a constitutional implication. Next slide. Law Society as well. They regard it as very serious indeed if privileged correspondence were to be intercepted. They have been. Next slide. Reprieve. What we have learned about the scale and reach of the security service's ability to monitor online communications has far-reaching consequences of our ability to hold the state to account. That's pretty hard-hitting. Next slide. Julian Huppert, who came and talked to an event we held in Parliament in March for the IATF were in town, he and David Davis almost have similar views as far as I could tell. What is needed is a complete review of almost all the laws we have in the UK relating to this area. Next slide. Tim Berners-Lee, World Wide Web Consortium, founder of the World Wide Web. Government spying is threatening democracy as you know it. Security services need to renegotiate that trust with the British people. That's almost Winstonian. Next slide. The IATF, this is really where I started to get involved in looking at this. When the IATF in the Vancouver meeting last year argued that this activities of evasive monitoring, to call it, was actually a multifaceted form of attack that is indistinguishable from such. And the other thing that I think is intriguing is that the discussion has come down to that the threat model faced by this has not been actually considered at all in the protocol design and implementation or deployment of internet networks today. So it's sort of like a black hole. But the other interesting thing, I think, which is intriguing, and this is where Ian's points come into play, is that purely technical response will not solve the problem. So the problem is both technical in the sense of how do we mitigate this, but the other thing is actually it's largely only going to be solved by having some kind of societal response and some combination of the two. Next slide. we're getting some very interesting feedback from people, some very sensible and interesting comments coming from very senior people. I thought Keith Bristow's, who's the NCA Director General, this speech here, this is a fairly selected brief, but he said a lot of other things as well in terms of operational stuff. But in the big picture, he says, when it comes to some of law enforcement's digital investigation techniques, we have not yet explained ourselves well enough. And in my judgment, we do not yet have public consent for their use. Okay, next slide. So what's actually happening at the moment? Just very briefly, the IETF is the Internet Engineering Task Force, which is the body, loose-knit body of people who actually come together to create internet protocols. That's all the stuff you use to connect to the internet and all the stuff you complain about when you get hacked or something goes wrong. Okay, they're looking at implementing and simplifying the use of encryption. One of the great problems I have, and I think all people have, is it's really complicated to get some of the stuff to work. The other area that's become much more focused in people's minds is, what is the value of metadata? What does it mean? And there are legal definitions, which I'm sure people on the panel can explain in great detail to you. But what is actually the value in terms of having it exposed or not having it exposed? How do we deal with that? The other issues we found is that we have bugs. The greatest security problem we have in almost all areas of IT, always has been, is that we release products and services which aren't ready. You know, everything's in permanent beta test if you're optimistic, and alpha test if you're actually realistic. You know, and we found this with OpenSSL. I mean, they released years ago an extension to OpenSSL that's called Heartbleed, which turned out to be a complete hull. Fortunately, my own servers, I only had one group of them that were vulnerable to that. But the process of having to revoke certificates and go through that whole process and then renew them and then sort of get everybody online to do it is an absolute pain. And the other thing that's come out is that something we all knew, but we didn't do anything about, which is all these open source movements. They're fantastic, and we use them for absolutely everything, and they're free to use, and why not? Turns out, actually, they're very poorly supported. We just cannot sustain the level of what Paul Raymond used to call many eyes to keep the thing sane and safe. That has failed. Certainly did with OpenSSL. So other movements like Libre and Google are now beginning to sort of step into that breach. Now, whether that's the right approach, you know, it's a helpful approach, but whether in fact, you know, we need more, or whether we need deeper, or whether we need both more and deeper, you know, is a question we need to be asking. The other thing that's happening is quite recent, and it's becoming very serious, is a focus away from this sort of architecture of the internet we have today, and moving to a much more decentralized, fluid environment. So that's actually moving from the clouds, as it were, people sort of say, to a very much more interesting area. New slide, please. Very quickly, I don't need to go through this. I think most personal corporate privileged communications and data can be exposed, and we can't really control it at the moment in the policy sense. We can negotiate to some extent, and I think that's about it. The effective oversight of policy reflex is really up for grabs at the moment. My sense for the Security Committee in Parliament is that they are asking questions. They're asking for where the balance lies between privacy and security. Whether that's the right question, I think, is one we have to actually really seriously consider. And the answer to that may well be very specific to what area we're talking about. It may not be a generic answer. Next slide, please. So the debate is developing. It started in the 70s, Duncan Campbell, who gave us various insights into how this is working in the telephone network. We have several professional bodies now pushing for reform, certainly for their own members' interests and their own community's interests. The engineering community in the internet is also looking at this in great detail and working on it, both in terms of the underlying internet and also in terms of the applications of World Wide Web. But I think the terms of reference of how we take this forward is not completely settled yet. This is actually a larger issue than just in the UK. There are a lot of issues here which go into international dimensions that Ian was talking about. There are commercial issues as well. How much do we And philosophical ones, how much do we rely on markets, for instance, to govern this? How much do we need legislation? Do markets self-regulate sufficiently to manage some of these issues? Arbitration, all these other areas. If we had a more open security policy and we wanted to, would there be some mechanisms for handling these things in a different way? These things I don't think are yet in the frame properly, as to understand how we might go ahead. Next slide. The other side of the coin is we have problems, you know. So I think an immediate reaction, to recommend an immediate reaction, just say stop all what you're doing now would be completely wrong. I think we need to think about what we want to do next, and then when we have some confidence in that, move to a new framework. I also quite interested by the US judgment recently, where actually if you have a phone in your search, you have to actually get a warrant to look inside it. I think that kind of idea is a really important thing to take on board. You know, if you've got all your data on a phone or on an iPad or, you know, whatever you're carrying, it is equivalent of, you know, going into your house and searching your drawers. You know, and that sort of part of the law does need to be reevaluated, I think. I'd also urge people to think about metadata very carefully. You know, it is personal data. It may not be content in the legal frame in some areas, but it is personal. And the other thing I say is emphasis on grey areas. I have another slide as to what I mean by that. But next slide. I've addressed this slightly already, but the cost, according to Vivian Redding, actually she's requoted a quote that was handed out somewhere in the US back in the end of last year, is the cost to the US cloud computing industry is already between 22 and 35 billion in lost revenues for the next few years. That's just for cloud. So it's not just reputation damage, this is damage to actual business. And if it's having that effect there, it's obviously going to have an effect here in the UK industry as well. That needs to be considered when we're having these policies. There's a risk-reward here. Next slide. So I think I've basically covered that. We need to support Parliament, particularly, to develop oversight mechanisms and to re-emphasize the debate on this area. I think all professionals in security need to look at this. We need to look at this both in terms of constitutional issues, because there are some constitutional issues that have emerged, but also in operational stuff. And how we divide that up is going to be, you know, quite difficult, I think. There's a political fear of failure. When I talk to people on the IC and other committees in Parliament, you know, there's the media problem. Well, what if somebody gets through? You know, then we've got egg on our face and worse. That has to be dealt with as well. That's a general awareness issue for the British population and other people. Operational safeguards and so forth. The most important thing is oversight, and I think reflexivity. Any system that gets put in place, I think, needs to be reflexive. It needs to be able to give feedback on what's happening, how it's happening, what's working and what's not working, back into new policy developments. I don't think we're going to fix this in one hit. That's going to take a change of mind, change the way we do things. Next slide. Next slide. Oh, yeah, sorry, one stop that. Okay, does anybody actually fitted a telephone network together? Okay, so you're speaking to Bertie. I just thought very quickly, I don't want to go into great detail on this, but just why it's different, why we have laws on interception which are different, why they don't work necessarily on data networks in the same way. The implications are different. So this is a very simplified one. It's not entirely accurate, but essentially telecom signaling is handled on a separate physical cable. So we have a wire, we have a law that says you can take the signaling data. If you want to do that, you just connect to the signaling cable over a protocol like SS7 or SPN. Next slide. So it's distinct. You're not getting the content, you're not getting the voice, you're not getting the fact, you're getting the fact with the signaling data of that, the address, if you like. With some, I hope Steve Deering's not watching this. This is Hourglass of the internet, the original one. The internet, of course, data networks don't do that. We have everything all in one thing normally. It all goes across, or you can't predict it. So we have the internet protocol itself, which is the area where we actually have the global interconnections. That's how we have addresses. That's how we know where we find each other. And then we have all these applications and things over it, like the web, and email, and all all the gubbins to do the error correction in between. These all create data, metadata, right? So each one of these will have strings of metadata that will be stored in different places. Some of it's stored on the devices, some of them in the cellular systems, some of them in cell networks. There's GeoIP coming out of the ISPs. So all this is data, data, data. And all this, to some extent, is up for grabs. It's a very rich environment, very, very different to the telephone network. There's a lot more metadata here. Next slide. Complexities are happening in the internet. People are not deploying end-to-end addresses as much as they should be. So what's happening is they're breaking the internet, normally being at the edges at your homes or offices, but it breaks a number of security protocols. So if you want to communicate user to user through an AT, you're going to get some breakages. Next slide. That makes you vulnerable because you're having to trust somebody in the middle to have a security policy that works for you. Now we've got to a new situation, it's even more complicated, where we've got carrier-grade NATs. So this middle bit of the internet is extending itself, becoming much more complicated. And then we've got cloud providers, some using NAT IPs, some using NAT IPs with carrier-grade NATs. So you've got double breakages, double reliance. People who are rich can have static IP addresses. People who are poor can't. That's the internet we're moving into. Very, very interesting. Underneath all this, our intelligence service people, apparently this gray area, are still zapping all this information. But instead of the information being just the telephone signal data, it's a huge array of information. That's why we have this escalation. Next slide. So what next? Well, if we invent laws and services to answer those questions, we may well miss the point because actually things are starting to move into a different direction. And it won't happen immediately. It's already starting. We're starting to find encrypted peer-to-peer networks between users, services, and devices. We're looking at secure transaction chains, which don't need men in the middle. Again, we're looking at distributed registry and identifier services, again, which don't need men in the middle. So this intermediary hierarchical model for internet we've seen before, with everything going through the hourglass and everything being mediated, is being dispersed. So when we consider what we do about all this stuff, we need to keep the fact that the internet model and telecom model that we kind of understand a little bit, we don't understand what's going to happen here, but it is going to change, and is changing. I think that's basically all I want to say.
Thank you very much, Christian. Are there any questions specifically for Christian before we go on to the next? Robin? If people would say their names, that would be helpful.
Thanks. Robin Wilson from the Internet Society. Thank you, Christian. I think there was something about, you talked about the increase in metadata that results from that layered network model. And one of the very interesting developments I thought at the IETF was that Stephen Farrell followed up his description of pervasive monitoring as a form of attack by suggesting that we should try to minimize metadata at all of those levels. And I think that's a take on privacy by design that we haven't really encountered before. It's has tended to be seen mostly at the application layer. So with your operational and deployment experience, what do you think is the practicality of extending that approach further down into the network layers?
It's tough because, as Stephen also said in the Purpass working group, is that actually none of these protocols were designed with this sort of prep model in mind. So, so it's going to take some rewriting, I think. Now, you can do certain things by sort of implementing fixes in switches or routers and what have you, or what have you. But then you're kind of moving away from a standards-based environment, and that itself is actually maybe an even bigger problem. So I think it's the way we can mitigate this stuff initially, I suspect, is that you keep to the standards-based environments and not try to play with the network bits too much. Focus on what you can do at the edges, and hammer your ISPs and network providers in the middle if they start to do things in the network, break your solutions from the edges. So that means, you know, if they are deploying carrier-grade NATs and forcing you through various layers of obfuscation, or they're doing things like well, they're based on net neutrality. They're trying to sort of say you can't run that application efficiently. We're going to introduce latency for this, for instance. That is slowing the traffic down to optimize it for something else that they're getting paid for. Those sorts of things are going to be the real danger points for people to fix that, I suspect. So I would focus on the edges, I think.
Thank you, Khaled Fatal. I think you, at the initial part of your presentation, you mentioned a key point which I thought was very, very relevant, that there's really no solution unless you engage with a lot of, I'm using my own word, stakeholders, so to speak. When some of the issues, all of the issues you referred to and part of the solution, I personally don't see that the technical standardization is really alone could be sufficient. I think we may be able to reach solution by consensus through dialogue and engagement, and we've been doing this through our summits as well. And that is taking the conversation and the debates to local stakeholders across all sectors, so that they can be part of the solution and building it up as we go forward. That's probably where some of the technical solutions could be found. But as it stands now, I think unless we approach it that way, I think the risk gap is going to get bigger and bigger. Sorry to sound pessimistic, but this is my take.
I'm not so pessimistic as that, Khaled, but I sense actually quite goodwill amongst in the UK, actually, across the board. And people don't want to be blown up in their beds.
Referring more the international scope rather than the UK.
Yes, I mean, okay, so I think all people need to have some view on what they want to do about this, and I would agree with you. There's a challenge there. But and also this idea of multi-stakeholderism is very new and fresh and undefined, actually, and it's not easy to put your finger on exactly what it means in different contexts. So we're dealing with a lot of sand, and I think if we're standing on it, we can expect to be swallowed up a bit. I think really we need to sort of focus on good actions and what we really want to see, and try to mitigate the damage. We won't solve all of the problems. But if we have good societal responses, a good institution building, or doing things with existing institutions so that they can work in fresh ways through digital media, then I think it would be successful. I sense goodwill on the whole. I think people are generally beginning to understand that there is an issue here, that people aren't just saying, you've got to stop it completely, but there needs to be under some degree of oversight and control and work.
No, I would totally agree with you. The challenge that I see is moving into the new phase of this new internet ecosystem. We're going to be, the huge challenge is those communities or countries that are not coordinating or do not believe in the same ethos that you and I would agree, and some of the good things and the goodwill that are coming out of the UK example. I would call the weak link, to make sure that this new internet ecosystem is a force for good rather than a force for a lot of bad that will happen. And can we fix everything? Absolutely not. But at least unless we engage on finding perhaps mechanisms or solutions on an international scale, we will find that we will be even more challenged coming in the near future. Thank you.
Well, I think that's true.
Thank you very much. I'd like to hand over now to Andy Smith.
So I'm going to give a bit of a counter view to these guys. and play a bit of a devil's advocate. I've been working in cybersecurity and counterterrorism for far too long. You can tell by the grey hair. And I think Edward Snowden has actually made the world a much more dangerous place. And he has certainly made it a lot more dangerous for democratic societies. Prior to Edward Snowden, everybody knew that we had Echelon, we had people monitoring, we had GCHQ, the NSA, loads of governments monitoring the internet, collecting data. But they were quite happy with this for the most part because the security services were protecting them. Following Snowden, it's now come to the fore, it's on the newspapers, etc. And we have a situation where people say, oh, you know, privacy, human rights, you're abusing my human rights. Well, I can tell you, terrorists will quite happily abuse your human rights. And it is now much more difficult for security services and law enforcement to protect you. And we are now hitting a situation, and this is where the internet governance is so important. This is where UK IGF, United Nations IGF, has a really big part to play. The internet governance is broken. We've swung way too far to the human rights and the privacy advocates and the tree huggers, all those people that want anonymity on the internet. My view is if people really want anonymity on the internet, they want it for a bad thing. They want it for cyberbullying or because they don't want to be discovered. And we're now making it much more difficult for law enforcement to track down and stop these people. Take the Russian business network. Most of the members of the Russian business network are multimillionaires. We know of organized crime gangs where even their secretaries drive Porsches. That's your money they're stealing. Yeah, that's your money they're using to buy those Porsches. Look at ISIS. They're not just sweeping across northern Iraq, they are sweeping across cyberspace. Their online campaigns, their recruitment campaigns are being very effective. There's over 500 people from the UK gone to join them. Once they've got themselves sorted out there, those guys are going to come back here, and we are going to have trouble stopping them. We're used to it in this country. We're used to the IRA blowing things up. Now we've got rid of the IRA, we're going to have ISIS. We're going to have other terrorist organizations, and we are making it so much harder to prevent this and to stop this. So, yeah, it's all good having these wonderful laws and all this privacy stuff. But I can tell you, people like GCHQ have neither the time, the inclination, or the interest to read people's emails. Look at the volumes of data. You honestly think people are going to sit and read that stuff unless there is a damn good reason, because they are after specific individuals who are out to damage democracy, who are out to damage our way of life. We've got to make sure we don't swing the pendulum too far to the human rights side and give terrorist organizations and serious organized crime tools to use against us. They don't care about you, your life. What they care about is stealing your money or using you to further their cause. The laws are supposed to be there to protect the majority from the minority. We now have the Human Rights Act being used by the minority, including terrorists and even people we've put in prison. Abdul Hamza, using the Human Rights Act to stop being extradited, to stop himself being extradited. We've got other terrorists using human rights to stop themselves being extradited. That puts us at risk. And we have the same online. And this is where internet governance is fundamentally important. Both the guys before me have said about transnational cooperation. If you've got an organized crime gang in the Ukraine using servers in Romania to attack businesses in the UK, you don't want to be waiting 18 months for them to follow through on some paperwork. You want real-time tracing back to the source. You want to be able to ring the guys in the Ukraine and say, they're at this address, go get them. We need better than the agreements we've got at the moment. We need better than bilateral agreements. We need everybody working together to try and stop these organizations. Otherwise, you know, our freedoms, our way of life, you want these human rights, you want your right to freedom of family life, but yet a lot of people are working against their own desires in stopping our law enforcement and security services protecting those ways of life. So, you know, it's really up to people like IGF to help keep that balance and stop people swinging things too far in the wrong direction. So I'm going to shut up now, and I think we'll open to questions.
Specific questions, a couple of specific questions to Andy, then I'd like to get back to what can we do next.
Okay. Thank you. Kate Russell, BBC Click. I would like to just put a little bit of balance against your opening statement about Snowden making the world a much more dangerous place. From a consumer perspective and working in the media as I do, the one thing that Edward Snowden has really done for average internet users is made so many more people aware of the fact that they need to protect themselves, that they need to run firewalls, they need to be safety conscious and aware. And I think although, yes, I agree with you that it's made the security services jobs a lot more difficult, I think the general awareness of the need to protect themselves and the risks that there are on the internet has had a far greater impact on the average users, the average internet user's ability to protect themselves and has stopped the petty criminals from getting inside their computers and stealing their money, much more so than GCHQ or the security services could. So I think there's a balance definitely to be had.
I'd certainly agree with that. We are seeing a lot more people with antivirus, with firewalls, looking after themselves, reading terms and conditions rather than getting taken in by organised crime that are using terms and conditions to peddle their wares. It is making more people aware of online security, and basically crime will go where the money is, and the money is now on the internet, and that's where crime's going. So people protecting themselves against petty crime, a really good thing. The things that scares me are people like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, organized crime and terrorist organizations who are now starting to use the internet and starting to use distributed denial of service, use the internet for recruitment campaigns, and basically abuse on a big scale. That's where I'm getting really worried.
Yes, I think that's a good point. And I think a related benefit of the Snowden disclosures actually is that it's forced much more than before the different parties to engage in this discussion. Actually, Andy, I'm sure it's true that many of the people at this meeting were fully aware of the echelon disclosures from the European Parliament and Duncan Cameron and so on. I don't think it's true of the broader population. I think it has brought these issues to the attention of a much wider group of people. And I think the only way that we will get the international cooperation that we all agree is necessary is if we are thinking in the round, thinking about the needs of the intelligence and security agencies and their capabilities to investigate and hopefully prevent serious crime and terrorism, but at the same time to make sure that we are protecting people's human rights. That can be sometimes a difficult balance to draw, but we will only find it if we have the debate. And so that, for me, is a positive thing. There's much more debate now. There was an interview yesterday with the new director of the NSA, Michael Rogers, where he said the sky is not falling. That yes, some groups have changed their online behavior, but NSA does not think it's a catastrophe. So I think it's difficult, but we must keep on having these discussions.
I totally agree with you. My only slight reservation is that I think there's not more to be done for users at the edge of the network today. Most of the efforts have been made in the last, since on the web. It's got a very centralized, winner-takes-all business model that's taken over. And it's a model also being followed by governments and government departments as well, largely, like to mimic what they see outside. I'd like to see a lot more tools and services available free of charge for users, so that's really simple for them to use, particularly things like integrating security in their email, for instance, that kind of stuff. It's actually really hard. If you've got free devices, which is not uncommon these days, actually implementing security in all those devices and get your private keys across them securely is a very tough challenge, even for people who are very technically literate. And in fact, the chair of the ITF working group concerned, we've been debugging each other's emails and what have you, because there's all sorts of mail transfer agencies in between that cause problems. So it's not a given. There's a simplicity of use issue alongside actual capability of use. And it's very complicated to do today. A lot more work needs to be done to make that simple.
Just quickly, yes, you're right. It is really good that we're now getting a lot more people aware of the problems, and they're doing a lot more to protect themselves. What I'm worried about here is knee-jerk reactions, especially from governments and the European Union, etc., where they put into place laws that actually make it a lot harder for us to protect democracy.
Yeah, and then at the back.
Okay. Sorry. Robert Wilson. Andy, I've followed your work with respect for years. I think the last time we were in a room together, you were helping Helen Goodman understand why it was often a good idea for people to self-assert bogus details. So I think essentially your argument is, trust us, we have your interests at heart. And in a democracy, that's how it should be. Clearly, the intelligence and law enforcement services should operate because the public trusts them. But I think there are things that undermine that trust. And I think, for me, what the Snowden revelations did, among other things, was to clarify just how huge the gap was between what was being done and the awareness of the people we elect to exercise oversight over what is being done in our name. There was an MP who said he was on the Intelligence and Security Committee, getting committee name wrong, but that committee, who said that he was unaware of the intercept programs that were being operated by the government. And so there's an accountability gap there. I've sat in a committee room in the House of Commons where representatives of law enforcement argued that they needed to be given powers under the intercept modernization program because of the change from one kind of network to the more digital one that Christian described. And yet we find, just a couple of years later, that actually those powers not only existed, but were being used, both technically and legally. So there are things there that undermine trust that the public ought to be able to have, both in its elected representatives and in the people who exercise those powers on our behalf.
Yeah, you agree? Yeah. In some ways, I agree. There are things being used which can be done legally. There is a big problem that a lot of things under RIPA were done with sort of out-of-band signaling was okay, but you couldn't capture the data. And now everything's going voice over IP. All the signaling is in band. It's all actually part of the same IP system. So it's hard to differentiate between the two. And there is a need to have a level of clarity around that. MPs that reckon that they're on an intelligence committee and don't know this is happening are trying to cover their arse as far as I'm concerned. I really don't believe that they don't know about what's going on, and if they don't, they shouldn't be on those committees.
Fighting talk. We've actually got a question at the back, Philip, who I've been saying we'd take for a while.
I waited patiently. I'm really, really pleased. By the way, Khaled Fatal, and probably from the first and last name, you probably can conclude that I'm from a different part of the world. And I'm really pleased in your presentations you touched on key subjects. Some of them I would agree with you 100%, others I would disagree with you 100%. The threat you would talk about ISIS, the threat to cybersecurity, and also the Snowden revelation and the role of Snowden. If I could just bring us back to some of the words that George Bush and Tony Blair came up with, and they were right, but they delivered it totally wrong. It is a war or a fight of values. If it is our values that are to win, it would be based on the right principles. And we all recognize the role of government, not that it's the duty of government to protect us. But I do not see any value why the NSA would be spying on their partner, Merkel, for example. That's not relevant to spying on ISIS or finding out where the threats are coming from. Secondly, I become a bit annoyed when I hear the words that we're doing this because of democracy. You know, I was born in Syria. You know, please don't lecture us on democracy. We want democracy, but we don't want it to be installed. We don't want it to be an excuse. And here's where I have, it's public what I'm saying to you now, so my position is clear. We cannot sell the multi-stakeholder model while we are in the purpose of promoting freedom online, freedom of expression, while we recognize that the NSA is not only spying, but complicit with other big US business so that they can spy on us. Now, guess what? If they want to say, this is what we want to do, and we want to get your data because we want to provide you services, fine. But please don't label it in the name of freedom, because actually, this is what kills the value and the trust in the multi-stakeholder model. I myself am a big supporter of freedom of expression, of freedom online, provided it is not used for ulterior motives by others. And this is where I become violently angry that we have been, many people like myself have been used to be put in the front line, promoting and championing freedom, only to find out that the agencies have been using us to promote their own agendas. If this is a fight of values, then that has to stop. And this is where the law and Parliament or in the US Congress needs to step in to fix this. Then it becomes an issue of value. And the last point on the issue of ISIS, do you really think the NSA and the other agencies around the world did not know about people who just showed up in less than 2 weeks and took half of Iraq? I think that would be extremely naive. So the threat is real, but I don't think we should really mix it with promoting freedom and democracy. That's my 2 cents.
Thank you.
The theme is actually about governance, I think, and security, not just about Snowden and GCHQ and so on. Going back to the issues of protecting us and privacy and security, whose processes and governance processes are more important for most of society? Those of Google or those of GCHQ? Whose processes are more opaque? Those of Google or those of GCHQ? Question.
Okay, which of you wants to start with that?
That's a very good point, Philip. And it's why I think actually the European rather than the US approach on this is the right one, to set clear rules on privacy that the public and private sectors have to follow, rather than focusing only on the public sector. Because clearly, I don't mean this as an attack on Google per se, I mean very broadly, American companies, if they wish, have much wider discretion in how they use their customers' data. And I can't say the example they've set in the last decade fills me with any confidence on that.
Yeah, Phil, I definitely agree with you on this. Misuse of terms and conditions is a big problem. There was actually a thing in Metro this morning about it. There are a number of these large organizations that in their terms and conditions basically say anything you put on their website, whether it's social network or search, anything you put on their website, they own the rights to, and they can then use it. So you're probably right. There are a number of commercial organizations that are more opaque than the government, and that needs to be fixed.
And that's just the immediate problem, all right? So what happens when they start sharing and moving that data around? Okay, so there's a whole bunch of worms. And that's where I think Ian's right, the European approach is very interesting.
There's a question here. Right, I thought
I agree with all of what you said. I agree very much that we in the West have to live the values that we claim to stand for, and that we will just appear enormous hypocrites to other countries around the world if we don't. And I agree. It is also, I mean, I can say this from long personal experience. For example, when I've been a reviewer for the EU on their security research and development program, and looking at some of the proposals that were made, some of which really are, very, very dubious indeed ethically. But the broader point that links back to yours is we have to be very careful not to get sort of sucked into a spiral of insecurity, if you like, that the UK and other governments respond to security threats by saying, well, we're going to have to, start half closing our eyes towards some of those values just temporarily. And often, of course, you end up making then the problems worse.
Cut us some slack, please. I'm 56 now. So the UK, when I was born in the UK, right, it was a very different country, really, to where it is now. And we've individually all moved as British citizens in very fast, but some have moved faster than others. And our institutions, they've taken hundreds of years to evolve and grow and what have you, and they got things wrong and they got things right. And sometimes they were formed because we killed people to make sure they were formed, and sometimes they were formed because somebody good was killed and the bad person won. But that's an evolution of our history. That's how we are. So I think yes, I think the sentiments you express, on one level are right. And we don't want to be seen as being hypocrites, I think was used. But on the other token, we are learning, and this debate about security and the big S, as you like, and constitutional side, governance side of it, and constitutional side of it, is part of the ongoing development of our history. And we can be informed as much by what you say in Syria as we can be informed by what we're doing here, actually.
One thing I find very frustrating, I do actually agree with a lot of what you said. I spent 2 years living and working in Saudi Arabia. I've even been to Mecca. I've read the Holy Quran. I understand Islam quite well. Really frustrates me is extremists and terrorists being labelled as being related in any way at all to that. We had the same problem with terrorists in various other guises. I was talking about democracy in this country, and it's here where democracy is important in somewhere like Syria. Freedom of expression, and the ability to rule your own lives is very important, something you should have. What frustrates me is people like ISIS using cyberspace for recruitment campaigns to expel their messages, etc., and do it in a light that really shouldn't be there. And it's those sorts of things we need to be in a position to stop. And at the moment, we're not. It's very, very difficult to do that. You could argue that they should have the right to freedom of expression. But, you know, it is a case of finding balances, and we are learning. There is a lot of work to do in finding where the balances are between security and anonymity, human rights and protection and freedom. And I think IGF is an ideal place for these debates to be had.
I'm very conscious that there are a lot of people wanting to ask questions, but we're getting towards lunchtime. Could you, the two, you've got a question to ask and you've got a question. Are there other ones? Could we have them very quickly? And if you can possibly address the questions I said at the beginning, which is what should the UK be saying to take things forward in this, that would be enormously helpful. Then I'll ask each of the panel members to say the key thing that they think can take reduction in cybercrime and increase of cybersecurity forward.
Okay, I will be as short as possible. My name is Tobias Gonrum. I'm a working chair at the IETF in the security area. But I have to say one thing before I go into my question, and that is I totally disagree with the notion that people who want anonymity want it for a bad thing. If you go down that road, this is the road to disaster for democracy and for freedom. So having said that, I just couldn't let this stand here in this room. Having said that, my question is, one of the things I'm missing is the protection against corporate espionage for our citizens. And I'm wondering whether maybe our governments are actually doing enough in protecting corporates and citizens against espionage by other corporates or by other governments, and whether we need something like an international framework to harmonize a code of conduct. At the moment, this feels like a playground. You know, the guy with the biggest gun wins, and it's like the citizens are our children, and the governments are the parents, and the parents just go there and take the bag of the children, and you beat each other up over stuff. And I'm wondering whether we need some common sense, common code of conduct to work on that, because I don't like to live in that kind of world.
The question was put about the difference between Google and GCHQ, two big Gs. How do they treat our data and which would you trust? And my question is simple. How would you know? How would you know what is actually going on inside Google? Look at some of the stuff coming out at the moment. How would you actually know what they're doing in GCHQ with the information? Snowden's told us quite a bit, and I suspect this lobby hasn't told us because he wouldn't know. So would you trust either? But then would you trust the sort of company that you do business with on the internet not to sell your personal data? If you're in the slightest doubt about that, look at your spam box this morning. Which is more important? Where's the privacy? If the government is in any way in favor of citizens still having some privacy, they've got to do something about the commercial abuse of information, which is far more intrusive than any harm GCHQ could do to you. I mean, I'm all in favor of keeping GCHQ in a reasonable leash so they don't go too far and following rules. I'd like to see both Google and GCHQ implement whistleblower contracts, but I don't think that's going to happen in my lifetime. So what can we do next, asked the chair? Do something about commercial misuse of information.
Thank you. I'm going to ask each of our panel members to have a final word, both responding to those questions and saying the key things that we can do. And then I'm going to have Chairman's prerogative to say something at the end.
I very much agree with your anonymity point. I use Tor all the time myself. I think it is very important for human rights, and it's very interesting that as everyone knows, it came out of the U.S. Naval Research Lab. It's very useful for security and intelligence agencies themselves. And by the way, whilst NSA and GCHQ clearly can't spy on Tor protected communications quite on the scale that they can unencrypted data, I would imagine they'll have some interesting capabilities against targeted Tor users that Snowden hasn't revealed. The corporate espionage and other government espionage, I think it's a good point of discussion. I think there have been some hand waving over figures of alleged losses of corporate intellectual property that are not very well backed up. But I agree it's something that needs more looking at. On the government side, it goes back to the living our own values. I don't think the UK government or the US government or their European partners can stand up with a straight face and tell other governments not to spy on our citizens when they're doing what we know against the rest of the world. On the corporate data side, I agree that's very important, just as if not more important than the government side. Although Google, of course, doesn't have the power to throw you in jail or get you prosecuted or stop you boarding aircraft. So all sorts of things that can happen as potential consequences of government actions. I think that's actually why it's very important that the EU complete the updating of the European data protection framework and get the data protection regulation through the council. So thanks.
Not quite sure what to say. We've covered so many points. I think we're at a point of reflex at the moment. Things are beginning to hit some form of consciousness in a broader scale than they have done before. And my sense is that when we formed the Internet Society here, sort of '98 when it was, and when the OII was formed in around 2001, I think 2001. I think largely most people are unconscious about digital networks and digital media, actually. And there's a lot of talk about it, a lot of business plans around it, a lot of assumptions made about convergence of this, that, and the other. Some prove to be true, but in the wrong way, and some prove to be wrong in the right way. And I think we're still in that journey. Do we need to beef up security across the board for corporates? I think that's a matter for that comes back to the question Robin asked me, which is where do we focus on the problem? And I think the focus needs to be with the users, and it needs to be where governments and oversight and policy making and laws come into play, and how we evolve them. They need to take account, I think, of the growing awareness of people, and they also need to reflect a much broader discussion that's needed to create a working environment that actually is going to mean something for more than about 5 seconds. Corporates are big, most of them. They can look after themselves. That's generally the assumption. The problem's been more, I think, along the lines of what Philip was asking about Google. I think it's more a problem of that black hole that sits inside the data networks at the moment, what they do with this data, what else they're getting data from, how they're cross-referencing it, and what are they using that data for, and what's happening to it. The corollary to that is that we have another interesting thing we've discovered, which is we have suffered from data entropy. And actually, the assumption was always made that, oh, this digital stuff is going to be there forever, and you write your tweet and whatever it is, and in 2512, it'll come back and haunt your great grandchildren. But it probably won't even actually haunt them in 2 days' time in some of these services. The DNS itself suffers from entropy. You have to really maintain it and keep it running effectively all the time. Data gets out of date. That again is a security problem. It creates all sorts of holes. And And yet we design protocols that depend on the DNS all the time, more and more and more of them, DANE, for instance. So I think I think more people need to know more about and take charge of their use of digital networks. That's been my thing.
So I was playing devil's advocate a bit to fuel the debate, and it seems to have worked. But I do think it's important we get the balance right. In some areas, we are going too far towards the human rights and privacy side, and it does have a negative effect. But I also think IGF is the ideal forum to have these sorts of debates and have robust debates about this, so that we do actually come out with policies, legislation, and that supports a balanced model that protects people's human rights and also protects our ability to defend the nation. And the UK is in a very good position. I mean, we have data protection, we have human rights. We even have a whistleblower program enshrined in law. I can't remember the name of the act. But we are in a lot stronger position than most other countries. And we just need to make sure we stay there and we don't have knee-jerk reactions damage where we are.
Thank you. I've been furiously writing down key points that have come up, and I think I've got about half a dozen, which I hope you'll all agree with. One thing that really struck me when Ian was talking was that in the UK and in Europe, we tend always to talk about the European Convention of Human Rights. I think we would get our case over far more strongly if we talked about the international conventions that many other people have signed up with. And I think every one of us here should go from here saying we're going to talk about the ICCPR. The second thing that came across to me was, I think we all can agree that we need legislation for dealing with criminality on the internet that has a much, much faster response than that which we have now. So I think, again, we can all press our MPs and governments to ensure that we have legislation that allows a fast response that's appropriate for the kind of crimes that are happening on the internet. The third thing that came across to me, and it's come across in many of the things that people have said, is that we need transparency, both from business and from governments, about what they're doing in our name, and we need proper oversight, and that applies to GCHQ and to Google. The fourth thing that came across is that I agree absolutely, and I know that Andy does as well, that anonymity isn't just for bad things. I always say to MPs who say anonymity is terrible, it allows bullying on the internet, I say that you're great fans of Mumsnet, and now I'm being persuaded by my daughter I've got to be on Grandsnet, and that's entirely anonymous. And it's anonymous because people can kind of give advice without being recognized. They can talk about problems without being recognized. And in a very personal sense, that's true in exactly the same way as you need anonymity if you're dealing with a repressive regime. So I think all of us should use that thing. I think it's a very strong and important point to deal with protection against corporate espionage. And there are international groups that do this. They tend to be industry bodies like the Defence and Aerospace Organisation, International Pharma, and so on. And I think our government in its cybersecurity strategy and through BIS is actually pushing on that. I think it is something that we need to push further. And more and more countries like China, who one would have said abused intellectual property and things, are now starting to create it themselves and therefore want that. So I think maybe there we're pushing on an open door. So I think, as Christian said, we're at a point of reflex. I hope you agree that those are key points that we can perhaps take forward, and I should feedback this afternoon. Are there other key points that anyone would like to make? Carsten, yes.
Sorry, Carsten Maple, University of Bedfordshire and National Centre for Cyberstalking Research. I think one of the things that we've mentioned is about active users of the internet. If we think about Google Glass, and I know there are restrictions on how it can be used, but actually we're increasingly passive users. So data that's being collected all over, we talk about Internet of Things, sensor technologies. I think when we look at that corporate use of data, we must think rather than just protecting me as an active user of the internet, I'm trying to do something, where information's captured from me as a passive user is really important.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think there's an enormous amount to be spoken about the ethical use of big data, be it government data or be it commercial data. And I think it's a debate that has to happen before it gets worse than it is now.
Hi, yeah, I'd just like to really add into your summary that I'd really want to stress the importance of educate over legislate, and I think that goes into what Andy was saying as well about knee-jerk reaction. It goes both ways, right? If you don't use the sledgehammer of legislation, the internet is full of dark places, but education is a bit like putting up streetlights in that respect.
Thank you very much. I think that's very helpful. I would like to thank our speakers, and I'd like to thank you as an audience. I think it's been a great discussion, and we could have gone on right through lunch. Thank you very much.